Spring 1943. The Eastern Front. The earth was thawing after the winter of Stalingrad. Mud Rasputitsa had swallowed the roads, forcing two colossal war machines to a halt. It was a false silence. Nazi Germany was bleeding. They had just lost the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility had been crushed in the ice. Adolf Hitler needed a victory. Not just a military victory. He needed a symbol, a thunderclap to prove to the world and to his own people that the Third Reich still held the initiative. He looked at the map. There was a massive bulge in the German line, 100 miles deep, 160 miles wide. It was centered around the Russian city of Kursk. To any military student, it was an obvious target, an inviting trap. Cut it off at the base, one thrust from the north, one from the south, and Germany could encircle 1 million Soviet soldiers. It could be a reverse Stalingrad. The plan was codenamed Operation Citadel, Zitadel. Its architect was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, Germany's sharpest strategic mind. Manstein wanted to attack immediately, in May, as soon as the ground hardened. He wanted to strike while the Russians were unprepared. Speed was everything. But Hitler hesitated. He feared the Russian T-34 tanks. He wanted to guarantee victory with his newest wonder weapons, Wunderwaffe. He ordered a postponement, waiting for the heavy Tiger tanks, and more importantly, waiting for the new medium tank, designed specifically to kill the T-34, the Panther. May passed. June passed. The Panthers were still being rushed through assembly lines in Germany, plagued by mechanical faults. Manstein watched the time slip away in despair. Every day of delay was another day the Russians dug. He knew that the element of surprise, the key to every blitzkrieg victory, was gone. On the other side of the line, Marshal Zhukov didn't need spies to know where Germany would attack. He looked at the same map. The Kursk Bulge was too obvious. Zhukov made a bold decision, one that went against Stalin's attacking instincts. He would not strike first. He would wait. He would turn Kursk into the greatest defensive trap in the history of warfare. Zhukov mobilized 300,000 civilians. Women, old men, children. They worked day and night, digging with shovels and bare hands. They didn't just build one defensive line. They built 8 of 250 miles deep into the rear. They laid 1 million mines, an average density of 2,500 mines per square mile of front. They dug 3,000 miles of anti-tank ditches. They built pack-fronts ambush nests, concentrating 10 anti-tank guns, ordered to fire only when German tanks got within 300 meters. They buried their T-34 tanks in the ground, leaving only the turrets exposed, turning them into steel pillboxes. Zhukov was building a meatgrinder, and he patiently waited for the Germans to walk into it. Early July 1943. The gamble was set. Hitler finally set the date. July 5th. He had assembled at Kursk an unprecedented strike force. 50 divisions, 900,000 men, 10,000 artillery pieces, and most importantly, 2,700 tanks and self-propelled guns. This was Germany's last Panzerwaffe, armoured force. If they failed here, there would be no more reserves. Night of July 4th. An eerie silence hung over the Russian steppe. German pioneers began clearing mines in the dark. In the south, Field Marshal Manstein was ready to unleash his most powerful punch. General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the elite SS divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf. They were equipped with the best Tigers. In the north, General Walter Model, who had always doubted the operation, commanded the 9th Army. He faced Rokossovsky's most heavily fortified defences. July 5th, 1943. The ground began to shake, but it was not German artillery. Zhukov, knowing the exact German H-hour thanks to intelligence and captured pioneers, ordered a preemptive artillery barrage. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire on the German assembly areas before the Germans could attack. The last shred of surprise vanished. Nazi Germany had stepped into the trap. Operation Citadel began not with a lightning strike, but with a brutal artillery duel. The gates of hell had opened. July 5th, 1943, 5:30. After the Russian counter-barrage, the Germans attacked. It was not an assault. It was a tectonic collision. 2 million men. 6,000 tanks. 4,000 aircraft. All smashing into each other on a strip of dusty, sweltering steppe. In the north, General Walter Model's Ninth Army slammed straight into a wall. Model didn't believe in blitzkrieg here. He knew the element of surprise was lost. He used Hitler's newest wonder weapon, the Ferdinand. A 65-ton monster, a turretless mobile fortress armed with a long 88mm gun. It was designed to be invincible. 90 Ferdinands led the spearhead. They rumbled forward, their 200mm thick armor swatting aside Russian anti-tank rounds like flies. But Zhukov had predicted this. The Ferdinands soon discovered their fatal flaw. They had no defensive machine guns. As they pushed deep into the Russian trench lines, Soviet infantry, the bravest soldiers in the world, did not run. They lay flat in their trenches, letting the steel monsters roll over them. Then they popped up from behind. They threw Molotov cocktails into the engine grills. They climbed onto the roofs, pried open hatches, and dropped grenades inside. The 65-ton monsters, helpless against infantry, began to burn, one by one. Model's northern attack bogged down after just 6 miles. It was not a piercing arrow. It was a fly caught in a spiderweb. By the second day, Model had to throw his last reserves into the fight, just to wrestle for every meter of ground at a tiny village called Ponyri. Ponyri became a mini Stalingrad. It changed hands dozens of times in 3 days, and there, the northern pincer died. But in the south, it was a different story. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein did not attack with lone heavy tanks. He used the Panzer Keil, armoured wedge, an arrow-shaped formation. At the tip were the massive Tigers. Their 100mm frontal armour was impenetrable to most Russian guns. Their 88mm cannons could kill T-34 seconds from 2,000 metres. On the flanks were the brand-new Panthers and Panzer IVs. Behind them, mechanised infantry in SD. KFZ 251 half-tracks. It was a perfect killing machine, moving as a single entity. It crashed into the Russian pack fronts. Deadly anti-tank ambush nests, 10 guns, camouflaged so well they were invisible until they opened fire at 300 metres. The ground exploded. The steppe turned into a sea of fire, dust, and burning metal. Temperatures inside the German tanks reached 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews fought almost naked, their skin blistering from the heat of the engines and gun breeches. But Manstein's wedge kept moving. Slowly, painfully, but unstoppably. They broke through the first defensive line, then the second. By July 7th, the SS divisions Leibstandarte and Das Reich had penetrated 20 miles deep. They were nearing their objective, the town of Prokhorovka. If they took Prokhorovka, they would break the entire southern defensive system. The road to Kursk would be open. Panic began to creep into the Soviet high command. Stalin, in Moscow, called Zhukov nervously. The Germans are breaking through in the south. What do we do? Zhukov, coldly, had the answer. He still had one ace left, a massive strategic reserve force that the Germans didn't even know existed. The 5th Guards Tank Army. 850 brand-new T-34 tanks, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov. Zhukov ordered Rotmistrov, advance to Prokhorovka. Stop them at all costs. 850 Russian tanks began to roll through the night, creating a massive dust cloud that blotted out the moon. They were heading straight for the SS Tigers. The stage was set for the greatest armoured clash in history. July 12th, 1943. The sun rose over a vast wheat field outside the small town of Prokhorovka. It was a hot, sultry summer day. The air was still. But the ground was vibrating. To the west, the I-2 SS Panzer Corps, Germany's absolute elite, was starting its engines. Over 300 tanks, including the Tigers of the 101st Heavy Panzer Company, commanded by Ace Michael Wittmann. They believed they were about to break through the final defensive line. The road to Kursk seemed open, but to the east, hidden by dust and the folds of the terrain, was General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. 850 tons, 3-4, and T-70 tanks. Rotmistrov knew his weakness. The T-34, with its 76mm gun, could not duel with a Tiger at long range. A Tiger could kill a T-34 from 2,000 meters, while a T-34 had to get within 500 meters to have a chance of penetrating a Tiger's side armor. So, Rotmistrov issued a suicidal order. Attack at full speed, close the distance, fight hand to hand. He wanted to turn a gunfight into a knife fight. At 8:30 a.m., a roar went up from the Soviet side. Stahl, 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 steel, steel, steel. The attack order rang out over the radios. Out of the dust clouds, hundreds of green Russian tanks charged. They ran at full throttle, their tracks crushing the wheat field. The German crews in their Tigers were stunned. They had never seen so many tanks at once. It was like a tidal wave of steel. The Tiger gunners began to fire. At 1,000 meters, every shot was a burning T-34. But the Russians didn't stop. They drove through the burning wrecks of their comrades, continuing forward. They accepted horrific casualties to close the gap. And then, they merged. The Battle of Prokhorovka turned into a chaotic nightmare. Dust and smoke from hundreds of burning tanks obscured the sun. Visibility dropped to a few meters. T-34 seconds drove circles around the huge, slow Tigers, firing into their rear engines. The Tigers rotated their turrets desperately, trying to catch the nimble targets. When they ran out of ammunition, the Russian tanks did the unthinkable. They rammed straight into the German tanks. Crews from both sides, when their tanks burned, bailed out and continued fighting with pistols, knives, and bare hands among the burning hulks of steel. The ground of Prokhorovka became a graveyard of metal. Over 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns from both sides participated in the battle in an area only a few square miles wide. By the end of the day, the field was burning. The Germans, with superior gunnery, had destroyed more Russian tanks. They still held the battlefield. Tactically, it was a victory for the SS. But strategically, they had lost. Their spearhead was broken. They had spent their ammunition, fuel, and strength defeating a reserve force they didn't even know existed. Manstein wanted to continue the attack the next day. He believed that with just one more push, the Russians would crack. But he hadn't counted on something outside of Russia. July 13th, 1943. Adolf Hitler summoned Manstein to the Wolf's Lair headquarters. Hitler was panicking. 3 days earlier, on July 10th, the Western Allies, Americans and British, had landed in Sicily, Italy. The second front Hitler feared had opened. "I need the SS divisions in Italy," Hitler said. "Operation Citadel must stop." Manstein was furious. He begged Hitler for a few more days. Victory is within grasp, but Hitler had made his decision. Operation Citadel was cancelled. For the first time in World War II, a major German strategic offensive was halted before it achieved its objective, or was destroyed. It simply ran out of steam. The Germans began to withdraw, and that was the exact moment Zhukov was waiting for. He hadn't just built defenses to stop the Germans. He built them to exhaust them. And now, as the German beast bled and retreated, Zhukov threw the real punch. Operation Kutuzov in the north. Operation Rumiantsev in the south. Not small counterattacks. Massive strategic offensives across the entire front. Millions of fresh Soviet troops, who had been resting while the Germans killed themselves at Kursk, now flooded forward. They liberated Orel, then Belgorod, then Kharkov. The Germans never regained the strategic initiative in the east again. The Battle of Kursk didn't end on July 13th. It had just begun. And it began the end of the Third Reich. The Tigers and Panthers had been defeated not by better machines, but by iron resolve and the seemingly endless resources of the Russian bear. July 13th, 1943. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler had passed judgment. Citadel was dead. Field Marshal Manstein returned to the southern front in a cold fury. He believed he was winning. He was wrong. He only saw the burning Russian tanks in front of him. He didn't see what Zhukov had amassed behind them. Zhukov hadn't just built a wall to stop the Germans. He had built a spring, and now, as German pressure eased, that spring uncoiled with terrifying force. On July 12th, even as tanks were dueling at Prokhorovka, Zhukov launched Operation Kutuzov in the north. Target: Walter Model's exhausted 9th Army in the Urel salient. Model, Hitler's fireman, now had to fight not to conquer, but to avoid encirclement. Elite panzer divisions, attacking just yesterday, now had to turn their tanks around, desperately trying to plug holes in the line. They were no longer the spearhead, they were the fire brigade. August 3rd. Zhukov threw the second punch. Operation Rumyantsev in the south. Target: Manstein's 4th Panzer Army and the city of Kharkov. This time, the Russians didn't attack German tanks head-on. They had learned from the Germans. They used their own version of blitzkrieg. Deep battle. Thousands of T-34 seconds, supported by millions of infantry and a revitalized air force, flooded past German positions. They didn't stop to fight strong points. They bypassed them. They drove deep into the German rear, cutting supply lines, hitting command posts. Manstein, the master of mobile warfare, was now being beaten at his own game. He didn't have enough tanks to plug all the gaps. The mighty Tigers, invincible in a duel, were now being abandoned because they ran out of fuel or broke down. They were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. The Russian steppe was littered with the carcasses of steel monsters worth millions of marks. August 5th, Orel was liberated. That same day, Belgorod was liberated. In Moscow, for the first time in the war, Stalin ordered a celebratory artillery salute. It was the death knell for the Wehrmacht. August 23rd, Kharkov, the 4th largest industrial city in the Soviet Union, was liberated for the final time. The Kursk salient was gone. Not because the Germans had pinched it off, but because the Russians had bulldozed it flat and kept going west. The Germans weren't retreating tactically. They were running for their lives. Autumn 1943. The battle was over. On the fields of Prokhorovka, the autumn rains began to wash the blood and soot from the tank wrecks. Thousands of machines, German and Russian, lay intertwined, rusting in silence. It was the graveyard of the German armoured force. Kursk was not just a defeat. It was an irreversible strategic catastrophe. Nazi Germany had bet its entire strategic reserve on a single gamble, and they had lost everything. They had lost 500,000 men, casualties. They had lost the majority of their brand-new Panther and Ferdinand tanks. More importantly, they had lost their most experienced soldiers and tank crews, men who could not be replaced. The myth of German qualitative superiority, that one Tiger was worth 10 tons, 34 seconds, had been crushed by the brutal reality of attrition warfare. Quality could not defeat quantity when that quantity was commanded by intelligent generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht was never again able to launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative belonged permanently to the Red Army. The road to Berlin was open. It would be a long, bloody road, lasting another 2 years. But the outcome had been decided on the scorched wheat fields of southern Russia. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich had its back broken at Kursk, and it never stood straight again.